This is 40k Today. Small enough to fit on the new minimum-sized boards. Clever enough to work out what kind of terrain we're in. And Overwatch? We get that for free.
Welcome to 40k Today. This is your daily injection of the most luxurious 15 minutes in Warhammer 40,000 fandom. Today is Friday, August 14th, 2020, or as some people like to call it, the 735th day of March. From the 24th and a half century, my name is Paul Murphy, your host. Today we're joined by one of the contributors of the Goonhammer blog, and we have a coaching tip from an amazing player from the southeast part of the United States. First, though, we have a poll question up on our Facebook page right now asking, do you enjoy Warhammer 40k video battle reports? A staggering 85% of you said yes. We've had hundreds of people cast their vote, and many of you left comments about your favorite style of report or content creator. Thanks a lot for participating. If you'd like to participate in the next one, please head on over to our Facebook page on Sunday to see our next poll question. We'll be checking in on the votes each day and announcing the results next Friday. Now, let's get this party started. This is the part of the show where I would blast a few of those exciting air horn sounds if I knew how to work a soundboard. Leading us off today is James Grover from Goonhammer, giving us their thoughts on the FAQ and the Reef FAQ we saw this week on the Warhammer community page.
I'm here today with James Grover from Goonhammer. Thank you so much for being on the show.
You're very welcome.
And you're going to break down this week's Erratas for us so we can all have a better idea of what is actually going on. So let's get started with that. What is your overall feeling for the changes that came down this week?
So I think overall they're really good. They're very much in line with what seems to be the intent of 9th edition, which is that Games Workshop don't want the rules to surprise you. They want the game to play how you'd expect. And overwhelmingly what we see this week is them tidying up exploits, sorting out edge cases, and making sure that everyone's going to be on the same page when they're playing games of 40k, which is fantastic. Because I think one of the problems with 8th edition was that a lot of the time you found that games played on tournament tables were quite different to games played on kitchen tables because people had sort of different levels of understanding of the FAQs and weird edge cases. And I'm quite glad to see those gotten rid of.
Excellent. Yeah, I actually did find that as well. Like even in just playing on TTS, how I played with more casual players was completely different than how I would have played with like my coach, for instance. But let's get into like the major changes to the core rules. What do you think is like the most important changes?
So I think the biggest one is terrain, because they've answered some of the key questions that were outstanding on how some of the terrain pieces work. And I think that's going to really bring terrain into its own. So one of the things they talked about a lot before the edition launched was how much more important terrain is. And I think just based on what was in the book, it wasn't quite clear how that fit together. But now it's much clearer. So the big changes here are dense terrain now works on everything. Well, has been clarified that it is intended to work on everything. So people weren't sure out of the main book whether you had to be able to claim the benefit of cover to get the benefit from dense terrain. You don't. So that means that vehicles can get the -1 from it unless they're massive things like knights, bikers and everything. And I think what that does is that means that blocks of dense terrain on the board make positioning really important. So you need to hide behind them to protect yourself. It helps you screen against alpha strikes. And overall, I think that will change the game quite a bit. The other one in that area is heavy cover. That was just straight up wrong in the book. It was the wrong way around. It said that when a charger attacks someone, they ignore the benefit of heavy cover, which kind of made it a bit pointless. Now it's the other way around. So if you charged, you don't get the benefit of heavy cover. So that's really important too, because it means that if you put something with a good save in a fortified position, then they're quite difficult to prize out with things like Orc Boys, who have lots of low AP attacks. And then the last one on terrain is they just tidied up that obscuring terrain, you don't get to wall hack it when you're shooting at knights. You do if they're completely blocked by a big Novarel or whatever, you still can't see them.
Excellent. Yeah, a lot of those terrain sort of idiosyncrasies and things caused a lot of not necessarily arguments at the game table, but a little bit of disagreements, I will say. So are there any changes to faction-specific rules that you think we should probably talk about?
Yeah, so there's point changes, and then there's some other rules changes that affect some factions quite significantly. So So I guess we'll quickly sort of do carriage targeting. That ended up not actually changing that much. That's changed twice this week. The first time was quite a sweeping change, which had a big impact on Harlequins and Orcs. So initially, the new rule was that vehicles and monsters under 10 wounds couldn't screen characters. That got rolled back, which is great news for those factions, and it now basically works how people expect it to out of the book. The main thing they've changed is that you can't cheese it by having two demon princes screening each other or whatever. And then the other big one from the general rules that affects factions is smites. So there's a few things here. So Grey Knights and Thousand Suns, people were wondering whether they were going to keep what they had in 8th edition, where they could ignore the escalating cost on smites. We'd kind of come to the conclusion that they probably weren't going to, and they'd have announced it by now if they were going to give that back, and that's been confirmed. They've basically said, no, you don't get to ignore that anymore. You need to find other ways to work to build your army now, and in the future you'll get cool new stuff in your codexes. And I think in general that sort of speaks to they seem to want Knights to be a bit more about quality units over quantity. It's not so much about controlling the whole game and the whole table with lots of things. It's about using a few good things more effectively. And then the other one on smites is you can't smite more than once with the same caster, which was just an omission from the core rules by the sounds of it, which was a bit exploitative with something like Magnus, who throws 2d6 damage smites around and can cast lots of times a turn.
Yeah, that was looking pretty scary for a while.
Yeah, it's a bit spooky. I mean, I'm a little sad I can't use Eldrad to throw 4 charged up smites, but I'll live. Then there were some specific changes to the factions. So Knights, both kinds of Knights got a huge boost, because one of the big questions out of Chapter Approved was which cost was correct for the Castellan, because the Chaos and the Imperial one had a different cost. The Chaos one much higher. They've confirmed that the lower cost was correct, which is great, because it's now actually not that much more expensive than it was when it was dominating the tables back in was it 2018, 2019? Yeah, late 2018, early 2019.
Yeah.
And it's very powerful. So actually, just at the tail end of 8, the few people had managed to make a Tyrannus Castellan work. So now they're actually cheaper than they were then. That's really interesting. A couple of the Forge World Knights got a point discount too, which I think is quite good news for Chaos. The flip side of Lords of War is that the Taunar, after its brief period terrorizing everyone's hearts and minds, has gone back to costing a sensible number of points. So you can't get 2 in an army anymore, which is probably for the best.
Yeah, no, I have no love for that Taunar. I had to fight one at a tournament 2 weekends ago, and if I never have to see one again, I would be very happy with that.
I think that's the experience of most people who've played against it. I've played against one once. I also wouldn't choose to repeat the experience.
Yeah, so there's just one more thing I think that maybe we should touch on, and that's the clarifications to Hunters Unleashed. Did you want to maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yes, this is the Space Wolf one. Yeah. So that this is another one that so due to the way they worded the first round of FAQs for Saga of the Beast, and effectively sort of had some bad wording in the book itself. Temporarily, Space Wolves all had OBSEC, every unit, Impulsors, Wolfen, everything, and that was quite good, obviously. One of the few tournaments that's kicked off in 9th so far had a high-performing list that was running a large number of Wolfen, because it turns out OBSEC Wolfen are quite good. That has been rolled back. Presumably it was an oversight in the wording. So that means Space Wolves are on the same footing everyone else is as regards OBSEC. We've got several players on our team who are keen on them and still like them and are happy to play with Infiltrators and Impulsors, but it does mean they don't just get to OBSEC everything all the time. And I think that was the right call, because it was a bit strange for them to have it and no one else.
Yeah. So in general, I guess we could say that the rules changes are just bringing a bit more balance back to the game.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think it's making the game play how you'd expect. No surprises. No pulling out a book and saying, actually, all my stuff has OBSEC because of this wording here in this FAQ. What you see in front of you is the game you're going to play. And the way you win it is by coming up with good strategies and good lists, not by coming up with an obscure ruling that only you know about.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for your insight, James.
Yeah. Can I do some quick shout outs?
Absolutely.
Just quickly. So we have a series on our website called Rules Hammer, which we have been doing a series on the rules for ninth. We are now updating those for all these FAQs, so we should have a fully updated set of articles covering every phase of the game and how it works in ninth edition. So if you're wondering about any of this, do go and have a look for that. And we're also nearly at the end of going through all our faction focuses, covering how all the different armies play in ninth edition. And in particular, if you're worried about Grey Knights or Thousand Suns, both of those were written with the assumption that they weren't going to keep their immunity to escalating smite. So if you're looking for ideas, go have a look at those.
James, thanks a lot for coming on the show. You guys do a fabulous job of breaking down the releases and have a heck of a team over there. If you're listening right now and would like to see a group demystify 40K, please check them out.
Today's episode of 40K Today is brought to you by Frontline Gaming. Frontline Gaming is a one-stop shop for all your Warhammer hobby needs, discounted products, American-made gaming mats and terrain, and a full line of miniatures painting service and daily hobby content. And this can all be found at frontlinegaming.org.
This is exactly the type of episode we need to get us grooving into the weekend. Next up, we have John Lennon bringing us a coaching tip about table talk. This is a difficult skill to master, and believe me, a lot of success on the tabletop comes from communicating with your opponents.
It's Friday, and that means that it's time for a coaching tip from one of the coaches of the Art of War. And today I'm sitting here with John Lennon. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. Always enjoy it.
So you're going to tell us a little bit about having a conversation with your opponent and how we can use that to become better at the game. So, what do you got for us?
Absolutely. So something that I always recommend to my clients is to constantly be asking questions of your opponent. There's so many different rules in Warhammer 40,000, and even if you have the time to read every book, there's almost always going to be at least one rule that you're not familiar with. So what I make sure I do is anytime I'm playing an army that I'm not 100% comfortable with, and honestly, even then, I make sure to ask my opponents questions throughout the game. So pretty much every movement phase, I ask my opponent, hey, do you have anything in reserve? Honestly, even if they didn't have something on turn 2, I'm still going to ask them on turn 3. As well, I always make sure to ask them kind of open-ended questions where if there's any weird interaction, it kind of gives them the opportunity to tell me about it. So anytime I'm bringing in my reserves, I ask if they have Auspex scan or something that affects my reserve. So maybe if they had a weird 12-inch aura that I didn't know about, of I can't deep strike like Clamavis, something unconventional, that would kind of be where they would tell me. As well, anytime I'm performing any kind of like intense combat maneuver, I always ask if there's something weird that they have with pile-ins. So, for example, you may not know that Alaris Terminators pile in towards the closest character instead of just the closest model. So if I'm ever basing something, I always ask, hey, I'm going to base you so that you can't pile in anywhere, right? And I'll always kind of put a question on it. Anytime I do something, I always make it a question to make sure that there's no information I'm missing and kind of give my opponent the opportunity to mention an obscure rule. Fortunately, a lot of players in this hobby are very friendly, so if you ask questions about the rules, they'll almost always tell you. That really eliminates gotchas. What I normally find is that when like these kind of situations come up where maybe a gotcha happens because you're not expecting a rule to exist and then it happens, it's normally because there wasn't a lot of conversation leading up to it. People will tell you their rules if you ask them, and if you ask an open-ended question, people will always kind of answer it to fill in that blank, just so that there's no situation later where you try to deep strike but you can't because of like an infiltrator unit. And if you had asked previously, do you have anything that affects my reserves? Well, if they don't say anything, then that's kind of on them being a bad sport. No one wants to do that. No one wants to just not give information. So I've really found that having these open-ended conversations with my opponent just gives me the opportunity to cover any knowledge gaps that I have. Now, I like to make sure that I read a lot of the rules in the game, like as many of the competitive army codexes, Psychic Awakenings as I can, just so that I know what to expect. But a lot of times there have been rules that I'm not aware of that I've caught before it burns me just by asking a lot of open-ended questions. I could give 100 examples of really obscure rules that come up. Often if I see a unit that I don't see a lot, so for example, something that maybe hasn't been very popular but now is, again, I could use Alaris Terminators as an example, ask if they have any specific stratagems. Just, maybe you see a Tyrannid Lictor, and who knows what a Tyrannid Lictor does? You haven't seen one since 5th edition. Just ask, hey, does a Lictor have any stratagems? And then your opponent may point out, yeah, this is actually the only way that Tyranids can ignore Overwatch. Just something like that, maybe as a Tau player you weren't expecting because Tyranids haven't ignored your Overwatch in the past 4 years. Well, there's one way to do it, and it's with a Lictor. And just asking those kind of questions anytime you see something unconventional just ask something open-ended, like, hey, does it have any weird rules or weird stratagems? And you can almost always get your opponent to tell you the weird interactions before it becomes a problem in the game.
Excellent. So, as a newer player, because I've only been playing for about a year and a half and only really seriously for about a year, sometimes I even forget my own rules. Do you have any advice for us if there was an unintentional gotcha moment? How can we fix that at the table?
So what I normally do is, if it's something like you forgot one of your own rules until it became relevant, I normally will honestly just tell my opponent, like, hey, I forgot I did this, and see if there's like an easy resolution. So I once had a game where I forgot to tell my opponent that Hive Guard ignore covered, and he went well out of his way to put his entire army in cover. And I kind of like realized, I'm like, oh man, like you're not even going to benefit for this. And I honestly, I just let him move. Just move a couple things, like instead of going sideways, moved a couple inches forward. It wasn't a huge impact on the game. Really, I just try to be nice about it. Obviously, as you play more and remember more of your rules, you'll get more of a hang of it. But for a newer player, or if you're playing a new army, I know I'm vulnerable to switching armies a lot. Anytime I get to that point, I just tell my opponent, I say, hey, let's just sit down for a second, talk about it. What would you have done? And sometimes the situation didn't really change. Like, they didn't know about a rule, but they weren't going to move any differently because of it. So I just sit down and tell them, and we just kind of work out what's best.
Awesome. Those are all super great tips for me as a new player, and I hope that other more developing players can get as much out of it as I did. So thank you so much for being on the show today, John.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot, Tanya and John. This is definitely a topic worth practicing. If you've made it this far, you know what's coming. Play that funky music.
It's the model of the day, the model of the day, the model of the day.
Today's model is none other than the legendary Ghazghkull Thraka. Ain't no party like a goth rocking party, because a goth rocking party don't stop. This beauty comes to us from a listener, Nathaniel Porter. He listens to the show, and I'm glad he did, because as a result, we get to see and look at this arising beast. This model draws you in with a deep black armor that serves to give amazing contrast to the iconic checkerboard pattern the orcs are known for. The bones are expertly weathered to give you the impression this guy's been kicking booty all over the galaxy for a very long time. The face looks like a photograph straight from the codex. Check this model out in the show notes. You won't regret it. Thanks for sending this over, Nathaniel. If you want your model featured in this slot, let us know on Facebook or Instagram using the hashtag 40K today. We really appreciate you listening, and don't forget to subscribe to get your daily power shot of 40K news, views, and interviews. If you're hearing this on YouTube, please join in the comments below. We really want to know what you think, or hear from you what might make a great future segment. Until then, I want to give a big thanks to our content producer, Alex Bainter, our technical producer, Seamus Ronan, and our social media director, Tanya Gates. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow for our weekend roundup with the best segments from this week. Until next time, from John, Steve, and me, Paul Murphy, thanks for listening.